Hi, and welcome to this introduction to systems thinking for HR and OD professionals. I'm Hannah Rogers, and I'm the head of systems and OD at PTHR. And much of my work involves working with HR and OD teams, supporting them to navigate complex challenges. So, for some of you, you might be brand new to systems thinking, and for others, you may have dabbled or explored in it in your own way. But my aim here is to make this feel accessible, practical, and especially relevant to the kinds of challenges that we face in HR, OD, and our broader people practice. So, I'm going to cover why systems thinking matters in complex environments, particularly in people and organisational work. I'm going to share 5 core principles that sit at the heart of systems thinking, one practical tool that you can start to apply straight away. And I'll also tell you a little about our 10-week Living Lab programme that's going to take you deeper into systems thinking and how you can practically apply this to your work. So let's start by exploring what is a system. Donella Meadows, who is a renowned systems thinker, she defined a system as a set of related components that work together in a particular environment to perform whatever functions are required to achieve the system's objective. So importantly, it's not just the parts that matter, but it's how those parts relate to each other. And it's this that what makes it something a system rather than just a collection. So that could be anything from a human body to a team to a process to a whole organisation. But a murmuration of starlings is a great example of a system in action. So each bird is a component that responds to those around it, and together they form a coordinated whole. So they're performing functions like avoiding predators, conserving energy, and staying together as a group. And there's no leader, they're just related components that are working in harmony to achieve the system's objectives, which in this case is protection, efficiency, and cohesion. So if we now look at what is systems thinking. So, systems thinking gives us a way of seeing the world through that lens. So, not as a collection of separate problems or parts, but as a network of relationships, patterns, and interdependencies. So, it invites us to shift from asking, what's the problem? Let's fix it, to what's shaping this? What's it part of? What's happening around it? And what that shift allows us to do is to stop focusing only on the symptom and start asking about the pattern. So we stop seeing problems as isolated and we start noticing the relationships and the dynamics. And that helps us to act more intentionally because we have a fuller view of what's going on. So one of the big ideas here is moving beyond reductionist thinking. And that's the idea of that we break a problem into small enough parts and we'll understand it better. And for many of us, that's a way that we've been taught to see the world. And sometimes that's really helpful, but in complex challenges, breaking things apart can actually cause us to lose sight of how those parts interact. So we can't then focus on the real problem and we really risk oversimplifying. And the solutions that we come up with don't land in the way that we hoped because we're treating symptoms instead of seeing those deeper dynamics. So let me give you an example where we see a spike in employee relations cases. So often a response could be that we would run more policy briefings or we would offer more manager training. But if you look deeper, you may see that what's influencing this is actually poor onboarding. There could be a culture of blame or performance pressure that discourages feedback. So you can see that if you don't look at the wider system, your intervention won't shift the outcome. So a metaphor that I really like to use is of a telescope and a microscope. So the telescope lets us zoom out in order to be able to see the big picture. So when we look into the night sky, we can see stars, planets, the moon, and all of them are distinct, but they're in relationship with one another and they together form a system. And it's the same in organisations that when we zoom out, we see patterns, power dynamics, structures, the things shaping how work happens. And so you start to see that what looks like a tidy issue is actually part of something bigger and much more complex. The microscope is where we zoom in, and that helps us to focus in on lived experience. So, what is it like inside the system? How people are responding, what feels safe and unsafe, what norms are playing out. And zooming in also helps us to create a boundary, so to focus in on one part of the system. Because if we try to take in everything all at once, it can feel completely overwhelming. And we really risk staying too far away to really understand what's going on. So we need both. And part of our role is to be able to move between the two. So zoom in and zoom out, and connecting the lived experience with the wider context. And systems thinking helps us to hold both at once. So if we know that systems thinking helps us to be able to see differently, the question then becomes, why does that matter? And in HR and OD, we're already navigating really complex issues and challenges, people, power, performance, and change. And the reality is that most of us already know that the work we do isn't simple, but it's messy, it's relational, it's full of tension and contradiction. But a lot of how we try to make sense of it still assumes that things are tidy. Using plans and processes, we assume that it's logical and it's linear. And this can work fine in predictable environments, but organizations that are living the dynamic systems and they're constantly in motion, which means that we can't predict or control the outcome. But what we can start to do is to learn to read it, to respond to it, and to influence it. And that's what systems thinking gives us. It's a way of working with complexity instead of oversimplifying it. A way of seeing these hidden connections, those reinforcing dynamics, so that we can act with more clarity and with care. I wanted to share one of my own experiences and early moments of realizing this, which was leading a leadership development program in an organization that was undergoing a significant transformation. The program, in terms of its design, was really quite progressive, and we saw some significant personal shifts. But despite this, there were limitations in how people could apply what it was that they were learning and that they were experiencing. And when we zoomed out, what we saw was that the structures, the systems, the processes, they hadn't shifted alongside the program and the people that were going through it and the capability that was being developed. And so the culture was still reinforcing old patterns. So while the program was successful by many measures, the impact wasn't as strong as it could be, as people were essentially swimming against the tide. And that's the thing about systems, is that if we only shift one part, the rest often pulls it back. So while the program didn't have the impact that we hoped in its fullest sense, it did allow us to learn about the system and consider what the next step needed to be. And in this situation, it was going deeper on what was causing resistance in the system. And by adopting a systemic view, we were able to notice how different elements were connected, how areas like structures, behaviours, assumptions, and culture were reinforcing each other, and how these needed to shift and to work in alignment. So the programme itself wasn't wrong, it was still very much needed, but it was only one piece of a much bigger picture. And I know for many of you, you will probably recognise something similar. You were already doing great work, the quality and the intent is there, but what systems thinking offers us is the tools and the language to go deeper. So having a way to make sense of complexity with more clarity and with more confidence. So I'm going to share with you now 5 core principles of systems thinking. So I'd invite you to see these as lenses. So ways of looking at your system that starts to unlock new insights and new options for action. So the first is everything is connected. And whilst that might sound obvious, in organisations we often forget that. So we treat things like performance, retention, well-being, engagement as separate issues, when actually they're all really strongly linked, but often that may be in subtle ways. And so if we take an issue of burnout in a team, we can explore, we can think about, is this a well-being issue? Is it a workload issue? Or maybe it's tied to unclear priorities, culture that doesn't reward saying no, perhaps weak team dynamics. So Systems thinking invites us to ask, what else might this be connected to? What else is influencing or being influenced by this challenge? Because when we step back, we can see this web of interconnections that helps us to make sense of what's going on and how we can use this insight to enable meaningful and sustainable change. And once we start to see how everything is connected, the second principle is that systems tend to maintain their own form of stability. So they develop routines, habits, assumptions, and ways of operating that help keep things coherent, even if these patterns aren't always helpful. And so that certainly doesn't mean that systems can't change. We know that they can, but it does mean that they often resist disruption unless those deeper conditions around them also shift. So when we introduce something new, such as a program, a policy, it interacts with what's already there. So the system responds, and often it pulls things back to what feels familiar. So similar to the leadership development example I shared earlier, the program was strong and it was well received, but it was introduced into a system that hadn't shifted, and so it struggled to take hold. So the culture, the expectations, they all continue to reinforce the old way of doing things. And that's why we find that even though we have well-designed interventions, they don't always land the way that we hope. And that's because the system is still wired for what came before. So systems thinking helps us to recognize this tendency and to ask better questions around where might the system be nudging people back to old patterns, and are we fighting the system, or are we learning from what it's telling us? So this second shift is really about noticing how systems protect the status quo even when we're trying to change them. The third is patterns, and that patterns tell us more than events. In HR and OD, we're often responding to events such as a survey score is dipping, there is a team in conflict. But systems thinking encourages us to zoom out and think about, is this a one-off or is there a pattern that's emerging here? Because it's often the pattern that acts as a signal of what's really going on. So whilst one, say, poor exit interview is important data, 5 over 6 months, or citing that there's burnout or that there's lack of progression, then that's a signal. And so once we notice that there's a pattern, we can start asking about what keeps happening here, what's sitting beneath this pattern, and what might we be reinforcing even unintentionally. The fourth is it's about perspective, and what you see depends on where you sit. So everyone in a system sees a different part of it, and no one has the full view. And that's why something that feels like resistance to you might feel like protection to someone else. Or what looks like poor performance in one part of the system might actually be a rational response to something that's happening elsewhere. So we really have to get curious about how others are experiencing the system, especially people at different levels or people with less voice in the system. So systems thinking invites us to ask whose voices are shaping how an issue is understood, who might be missing from a conversation, and what changes when I look at this from another part of the system. The fifth principle is change isn't linear. And we're often taught to think about change as a straight line. So if we do X, then Y will happen. And in some situations, that logic holds. But organizations as complex systems, change rarely follows a neat and predictable path. So every time that we intervene, whether it's a new approach, a shift in behavior, a conversation, the system is already starting to change in response to that. And that means that we need to pay attention to how the system is responding to what we've done by thinking about what's shifting, what's emerging that could signal a moment to act, and also thinking about what could I experiment here without having to overhaul everything. Because it's the smaller, it's more relational interventions. So the things that change conversations, rhythm, that create space for new patterns to then emerge. So systems thinking invites us to listen, to learn, to adapt, to respond to what's emerging, and so that we can respond with more clarity and with more intention. So those are the five core principles that I wanted to introduce you to. I now want to introduce a model that you might already be familiar with, but it's really worth revisiting through a system lens, and that's the iceberg model. So it's simple, but it's a powerful way of looking beneath the surface of an issue to help us to move from reacting to what's happening and to understanding why it might be happening. So at the top of the iceberg are events, and these are the moments that we often respond to, such as a resignation or a policy not being followed, or even a conversation in a meeting. Patterns are where we start to go beneath the surface and we consider what's happening over time or across teams. So, are there signals that this is repeating? Structures invite us to look at what's in place that might be shaping this. And this could be formal in terms of policies, processes, hierarchies, or informal, such as incentives, meeting rhythms, habits. And at the bottom is mental models. And these are the beliefs, the assumptions, the ways of thinking that keep these structures in place. And often these aren't written down anywhere, but they are fundamental in driving our decisions and our behaviours. So an example of these of mental models can be things like we can't slow down, or we'll fall behind, or feedback is risky. And at first glance, this can look like a neat and a layered model. But in reality, what sits within each of these layers is messy, dynamic, and interconnected. And when we start mapping patterns and structures, they all interact and they may be reinforcing, but they also could be contradicting each other. And you can certainly find that in when we start to explore mental models, we'll rarely find that there's just one belief, and we will find competing assumptions like we should give honest feedback, sitting right alongside telling the truth will damage trust. And these contradictions are part of what makes change hard, but also what makes this work interesting and really drives home why it's so important for us to get into this, to get beneath the surface, to really understand what's going on and what's driving what it is that we're seeing and what we're experiencing. So when we use the iceberg model, we're not trying to fill in a clean template. We're trying to surface complexity, and that's naming these interwoven, competing forces that might be holding a pattern in place. So part of using this tool well is recognizing that it's not a diagnosis, it's a way into a conversation. And it helps us to start exploring what might be reinforcing this pattern, where are the hidden tensions, and what sits underneath what it is that we're seeing. Coming back to our fourth principle around perspectives, importantly here is don't do it alone. When we work through this with others, we gain really critical different perspectives, because as I said before, what one person sees as resistance, another might be seeing as protection. So what looks like a broken process of one perspective might feel like, say, survival from another. So the more perspectives that we involve, the more understanding that we will gain of the system. So I just wanted to give you an example of this, taking performance management as something that we're all very familiar with. So in terms of the events, we've had some feedback from employees that they're not having regular performance conversations. But when we dig a little deeper, we realise that it's not a one-off, and that the pattern is more than just the absence of the conversation. It's how performance is being approached. So conversations are avoided or they're rushed. When they do happen, they feel one way or they feel overly formal. And we find that in some teams, they only occur in response to poor performance. Then we go to structures, and there may be a rigid annual process, performance tied closely to pay, and there may be no clear time or support for people managers and for employees themselves to reflect and to prepare for conversations. And informally, the expectation might be that we just need to get it done. So the structure and the beliefs around this can relate to this is a tick box exercise. This is not considered to be important. And beneath that, the mental models of other beliefs like feedback is risky. These conversations create more problems than they solve, and even that people should already know how they're doing. So now you're not just looking at whether the process was followed, you're seeing these systemic conditions shaping why performance conversations aren't meaningful, they're not consistent, and that there isn't trust in them. So the iceberg model helps us to slow down, to look deeper, and to widen our lens. And it invites us to explore what's holding current patterns in place and where there might be opportunities in order to shift them. So, if today's session has sparked something, if these 5 principles or the iceberg model feel useful and you want to go further, then I'd love to invite you to join the Living Lab. It's a 10-week experiential program which is designed to make systems thinking practical, accessible, and grounded in your real work. We meet for 5 2.5 hour webinars, which is spaced across the 10 weeks. And in between, you'll have time and support to explore your own challenge that you'll bring to the program. You'll be able to try out tools and you'll be able to reflect on what it is that you're noticing. What we also do during the sessions is that you work on a shared scenario with the group. So you can practice together in a safe environment, you can test ideas, and critically you can learn from different perspectives. So we learn and use tools that help us to be able to map out people, pressures, influences. We explore relationships and processes and structures. We understand where things might get stuck, and we reflect on our roles in the system and where we can have influence. So essentially, this is an invitation to be able to step back and to see the bigger picture of what's really going on through practical application of these tools. So it's always focused on helping you work with real complexity and learning with a small group of peers in a space that's supportive, reflective, and grounded in real life practice. So the next cohort starts in September. I'd love to have you with us. We've got a really wonderful cohort already forming. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, whether you'd like to explore something and whether you'd like to find out more about the programme. But thank you so much for spending the time watching this, and I really hope that it was helpful and applicable to the work that you're doing.